geography is a determining factor in the destiny of peoples. It is not an absolute factor, but it is a primary and important one, because this is what begins to shape the environment of nations or future nations. That's why some regions have driven great civilizations, while others have hindered the development of nations. And others simply served as absolute barriers, acting more like a kind of civilizational wall. These would only be partially overcome after tens of thousands of years of human evolution, with the arrival of modern technologies in the post-industrial revolution period. But some are, let's say, complicated, causing their peoples to oscillate between being conquerors and being conquered, because they serve as a connection point between rich and poor areas or to regions of strategic value. In today's video, we're going to see how geography was responsible for making a people the most enslaved in history. But before that, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, or follow us on other networks like Telegram and Instagram. And consider becoming a member of the channel. That way you'll get early access to videos, and exclusive live streams. I'm Dorian Pera, and this is Geopolítica Mundial. The case of the Slavs of Eastern Europe is curious because they were part of a chain reaction of conquests in medieval Europe. As waves of invaders from Central Asia pushed portions of the Slavic populations before them from the Ukrainian steppes to the Balkans and to what we now call Central and Eastern Europe, which pushed the Celtic and Germanic populations to the west. And the Slavs were also conquered by the Mongol Khanates, by the Germans, Bulgarians, Ottoman Turks, the Habsburg Empire, and even by other Slavic peoples. By the end of the Middle Ages, the Germanic invaders had pushed the Slavs back to the east of the Oder River and to the south. The Slavic invaders in the Balkans drove the Romanians into the hills and mountains of the Carpathians, which would lead the Romanians to develop an isolationist culture that was hostile to foreigners. Russian hegemony extended to the Poles and Ukrainians during that period, as well as to the non-Slavic peoples in the Caucasus, Central Asia, and the Baltic. Nations that were once great empires such as Poland, Bohemia, or Hungary would find themselves subjugated by countries that were very different from them. This history of constant conquests created a feeling of indignation and lost glory among the peoples of Eastern Europe, especially among the Slavs. Therefore, just like with other culturally fragmented, economically underdeveloped, and politically disunited peoples, the Slavs of Central and Eastern Europe were subjugated in many ways, as serfs owned by their own nobles or by foreigners, and were sold as slaves in the Middle East and Europe. Initially, when the invaders of the region shifted to agricultural production and were no longer nomadic, in the 6th and 7th centuries, serfdom was unknown to the peasants, who often sought the protection of militarily powerful nobles for physical security, in an era where brute force and violent attitudes were the norm. Over time, this dependence eventually turned into the system of serfdom as we know it today. This serfdom involved not only obedience but also the loss of the right to move freely. Serfs who tried to escape were often tortured when caught. Sometimes their hair was set on fire and their noses were cut off. And below the serfs were the slaves, with the main difference being that serfs belonged to the land and could only be sold together with the land instead of being separate property that could be sold on its own. In addition, serfs had certain rights, although most of these rights only existed in courts established by the landowners themselves. Nobres, proprietários de terras, tornasse esses direitos um tanto quanto vagos e ambíguos quando surgiam disputas entre os servos e esses proprietários de terras. Slaves, however, did not even have these minimal protections and could be bought, sold, traded, or even killed by their owners. Slavery here was not the same as that of Africans as people imagine, but rather of people, escravizadas localmente, whether for crimes or for debts, and some impoverished peasants sold their children into slavery in order to survive when the family could not support itself. Almost all of them were Slavs who were both serfs and slaves. This system of slavery was common in Central and Eastern Europe, and foreign raiders or conquering armies that came later, during military campaigns in the region, would take captured Slavs to be sold to other lands, including Spain, Germany, but mainly and in large numbers to Egypt and Syria. Dalmatia was one of the most enduring sources of slaves in all of human history, not only using the mostly Slavic population of that region as a source, but also Slavs and other peoples who were further east in the Caucasus or the Balkans. And we're talking about many centuries before the first African was taken to the Americas. The Slavs were being enslaved on a large scale and with no historical parallel. Russians, for hundreds of years, were enslaved by Turkish raiders and others along the Dalmatian coast for at least 6 centuries, while various groups of Slavs sold each other into slavery, competing for dominance in the trade in human beings with Iranians and Turks. The Slavs were so widely sold and associated with the image of slavery that the very word for slave was derived from the word for Slav in many Western European languages, as well as in Arabic, and not the other way around, as many people assume, from Slav meaning slave. And this outcome is due to the region's geographic factors, just like other long-term slave export areas. The Dinaric Highlands, which is a mountain range in southern Europe that crosses parts of Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, and so on, had environmental characteristics that promoted underdevelopment, demographic pressure, and political pressure, and as a consequence encouraged conflicts. A coastal ridge that rose like a wall from the sea inland, and other ridges formed parallel folds toward the Adriatic Sea. They separated the inhabited regions into narrow and long valleys called polia, each one isolated from the other by mountain ranges. Áridas, onde os pastos eram escassos e a comunicação era bastante difícil. Os poucos rios. The ones that crossed the barriers were not navigable, which discouraged trade and economic development here. And the narrow gorges that cut through the area couldn't be used by wheeled vehicles, a factor that would only change in the middle of the 20th century. Because of this complicated mountainous environment, natural disasters were usually local and sometimes limited to a single valley. This led to increased pressure for intense competition over resources among the people living there, which often turned into banditry and regional wars. Although the geography of this area was different from that of Africa, its effects on the people were quite similar, producing a cultural and political disunity that ended up making both peoples vulnerable to invading forces. E assim como no caso da África, those who captured people were not usually the same ones who controlled the slave trade. And this is very important, because both in Europe and in other parts of the world, warriors and pirates often captured people, and ordinary traders included slaves among the goods they sold. Almost all of the slave trade in medieval Europe was managed by Jews who sold white Europeans from Eastern or Southern Europe. Europa, nas fronteiras com o Mar Mediterrâneo, aos árabes e turcos otomanos. Like merchant peoples such as the Chinese in Southeast Asia or the Yao in Central Africa, who also included their own kind among the goods they sold. This practice was not seen as controversial at the time. This only gradually changed in Central and Eastern Europe as local nobles saw that serfdom was more profitable than slavery itself. This led to the system declining by the end of the Middle Ages. As for people being enslaved by foreigners, the consolidation of stronger states in the late Middle Ages and early modern era was a vital factor for the decline of this type of slavery in Eastern Europe. The emergence of a Muscovite state meant that anyone who tried to enslave Russians would now face a national army, as well as the rise of other territorial states in Eastern Europe. Surrounded their peoples with better military power, strong enough at least to block former invaders, especially the Islamic ones. The difficulties in establishing large nation-states in the Balkans, which is a mountainous area, left the peoples of this region vulnerable for a longer time. However, the establishment of states in this region and of empires that ruled over it put an end to the system of slavery. For this reason, when Western Europeans settled in the Americas and sought slave labor, Africa was one of the few sources that still existed at the time. The conquests of the Ottoman Empire in southeastern Europe placed many of the Slavs under Turkish rule, who forced these Slavic peoples to pay a kind of tax. This tax was collected in the form of male children, who were taken as slaves to be converted to Islam and trained for military positions in the Janissary Corps or for various civil positions, such as bureaucracy. Just as an example, during the 30-year reign of Sultan Mehmed, the conqueror in the 15th century, between 15,000 and 20,000 children were enslaved. And this still does not include the numbers of white girls, who were also sold in the Ottoman Empire and in North Africa. This practice would not end until the end of the 17th century, by which time approximately 200,000 boys had already been enslaved. Not all of these children were Slavs, but also included conquered Christians. But the vast majority of these children were Slavs and to a lesser extent Greeks and Armenians. The Ottoman rule in the Balkans lasted for 5 centuries and left a deep scar in the region. To varying degrees and for different periods of time, this kept many Europeans away from the cultural development of the rest of Europe during the rise of Europe's marginal powers. Just like all non-Muslim peoples conquered in the Ottoman Empire, the Slavs were given an inferior status under the empire's laws and policies. Furthermore, even in Christian communities, which were officially recognized by the Ottoman authorities, the Slavs were still assigned to be part of the Greek Orthodox Church structure, making them subordinate to the Greeks in both religious and secular matters. Despite all its strict and unequal laws, did the Ottoman Empire establish any rule of law in an area that until then had always been devastated and disorganized by war? And among people who previously lived at the mercy of local nobles, what made those nobles be forced to flee? After the Ottoman conquest and with Ottoman laws, the situation of the peasant became at least a little less harsh. Serfdom would then eventually begin. There wasn't much popular resistance in these areas to being ruled by Istanbul, and only in the following centuries would that change as the empire grew weaker, and the subordinate officials in Istanbul and the provinces gained more power, or did they become more corrupt and oppressive toward the people they governed? It was only in the last centuries of the Ottoman Empire that resistance to their rule began to become something really serious among the Slavs and other peoples of southeastern Europe. Although this region, southeastern Europe, ended up being divided for centuries due to wars between various European Christian rulers and the Ottoman Empire, the division was not always for religious or ethnic reasons. When Sultan Bayezid I fought against the Hungarians and Wallachians in the 14th century, for example, his troops included Serbs. In addition, the vassals of the empire generally included Christian princes, who were expected to fight alongside the Ottoman Turks. In any case, it is clear how geography ended up condemning the Slavs to the longest continuous period of slavery in human history. Something that would only be surpassed later, as other states such as the Russian state emerged. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to share. Vídeo com todo mundo que vocês conhecem para entender como a geografia acabou condenando. Take care and see you in the next video.